Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, December the 8th. We are in a 5-lesson study theme entitled God's Miraculous Work. So this week our lesson is entitled God's Miraculous Passover. Our focal passage is in the 12th chapter of Exodus, but we really need to take a look at chapters 7 through 11 as well as a lead up to the Passover. Last week, when we studied about God calling Moses to go back to Egypt and lead the people out, and to tell Pharaoh to let the people go. We saw Moses' reluctance that led to God agreeing to let Aaron be the spokesperson for him. And in the first part of chapter 7, God kind of reiterates to Moses and Aaron those details. And then he sends them to Pharaoh. And the first sign that Moses and Aaron present to Pharaoh is in the 7th chapter, verses 8 through 13. And it's similar to what we saw last week, the sign that God gave to Moses about his power, because Aaron threw the rod down, the staff, and it became a snake. And Pharaoh had his magicians to duplicate that feat. So he obviously felt that he had the power through his magicians, sorcerers, to defeat Moses. But while they could duplicate the rod becoming a snake, it records how Aaron's staff swallowed up their staff. And so it spoke of the superiority of God. But Pharaoh, despite witnessing this miracle, his heart was hardened, and he refused to heed Moses and Aaron, just like God had told them was going to happen. So this event is significant because it sets the stage for the subsequent 10 plagues that will eventually convince Pharaoh to let Israel go. So let's take a quick look at those 10 plagues. In chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, we have the first of the 10 plagues described. The water becomes blood. God acknowledges that Pharaoh's heart is hard and that he refuses to let the Israelites go. And so he instructs Moses to strike the waters of the Nile with his staff, and they turn to blood. And that caused the fish to die and the river to stink, and the water became undrinkable for the Egyptians. Now, again, the magicians are able to replicate that miracle, but it just heightens the devastation there. And so that situation lasts for 7 days, and the Egyptians resort to digging around the river for water to drink. And so again, we see the power of God demonstrated. In chapter 8, the first 15 verses, the second plague is described, the plague of frogs. God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go so that they can serve him. And he tells him to tell Pharaoh. If he refuses, God will bring a plague of frogs on Egypt. And God commands Aaron to stretch out his hand with his rod over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs come up and cover the land. And once again, Pharaoh's magicians are able to replicate that miracle with their enchantments, and they bring even more frogs into the picture there. And at this point, Pharaoh asks Moses and Aaron to plead with the Lord to remove the frogs, and he promises to let the Israelites go to sacrifice to the Lord. And so Moses and Aaron leave Pharaoh, and Moses cries out to the Lord, and the frogs die out, and so they gather those frogs up and heap them up. But again, Pharaoh hardens his heart and does not let the Israelites go. In verses 16 through 19 in chapter 8, the third plague is sent. This, in some of your translations, is called the plague of lice. In some translations, it's called the plague of gnats there. But it's a very abbreviated description of this plague, and it focuses more on the reaction of the Egyptian magicians in this plague. And here they are unable to copy the actions of Moses, and they admit to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, in verse 19. In verses 20 through 32, the fourth plague is described, the plague of flies. In this episode, we see detailed attention given to the bargaining between Pharaoh and Moses over what the Israelites may sacrifice to their God. Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites go into the wilderness to sacrifice if Moses would intercede for him. And again, we see the deceitfulness of Pharaoh because once Moses prays on his behalf, he refused to let the people go. And we'll see that again and again in Pharaoh's dealing with Moses. In chapter 9, the first 7 verses describe the fifth plague that God sent upon Egypt, the plague on livestock. The characteristic feature in this plague is the distinction that's drawn between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The plague that came on the livestock brought death only to the Egyptian livestock. And not one of the animals of the Israelites died, verse 7 tells us. But again, Pharaoh's heart remains hard, and he did not let the people go. In verses 8 through 12 in chapter 9, we see the description of the sixth plague, the plague of boils. And the important thing that's emphasized in the description of this plague is that the Egyptian magicians could no longer stand before Moses. Initially, they had been able to challenge some of the things that Moses and Aaron had done, but now they found themselves helpless in the face of these miraculous signs that are being done. In chapter 9, verses 13 through 35, is the plague of hail, the seventh plague. This one's much more detailed. The narrative focuses on God's divine power, and it reminds us that Moses and Aaron are just God's agent, and that the purpose of these miracles, these plagues, was to demonstrate God's power. So God instructs Moses to confront Pharaoh early in the morning and demand the release of the Israelites. And if he refuses, God will send a severe hailstorm. And God warns Pharaoh that the hail will be unprecedented in its severity. He advises those who fear the Lord to bring their livestock and servants indoors to avoid the deadly hail. And when Moses stretches out his rod toward heaven, God sends thunder and hail and fire upon Egypt. And the hail strikes down everything in the fields, including people, animals, plants. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. And this demonstration causes Pharaoh to acknowledge his sin and the righteousness of the Lord. And he asks Moses again to pray to the Lord to stop the hail, and he promises to let the Israelites go. Moses agrees. He prays to God. The thunder, hail, and rain cease. But once it stops, Pharaoh reneges on his promise, and he does not let the people go. In chapter 10, the first 20 verses describe the 8th plague, the plague of locusts. The most notable feature in this episode is the stance of Pharaoh's officials. They're getting tired of all of the devastation that's being wreaked upon their country. And so they try to persuade Pharaoh to reconsider his position. They're convinced of the folly of trying to stop the Israelites from going and worshiping their God. But Pharaoh, he moves a little bit. He agrees to let the men go, but the women and children had to remain behind. And so nothing happens again. In verses 21 through 29, the 9th plague is described, the plague of darkness. Several verses are added at the end of this, which draw attention here to Moses still being in the king's presence here, and it reveals the hatred of the depth of Pharaoh's hatred for Moses. Verse 22 says, Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. And they did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. And then Pharaoh called to Moses and said, Go serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be kept back. This time he agreed to let the women and children go. But Moses said, You must also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Our livestock also shall go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we must take some of them to serve the Lord our God. And even we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let them go. And then Pharaoh said to him, Get away from me, take heed to yourself, and see my face no more. For in this day you see my face, for in the day you see my face, you will die. And Moses said, You've spoken well, I will never see your face again. And so that sets the stage for the final plague, the 10th plague. And that's announced in chapter 11. There's only 10 verses in chapter 11 there. And it while he's still in Pharaoh's presence, Moses received a revelation from God. There would be one last plague which would cause Pharaoh to let the people go. Moses announced the plague to Pharaoh. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. In verse 5. With this final pronouncement, Moses left Pharaoh's presence in anger. And as a result of Pharaoh's unwillingness to listen, Egypt would experience this 10th plague, this terrible example of God's power. That brings us to chapter 12, and that's our focal chapter, because out of that 10th plague, there's going to be some things happen that are very important in Israel's history. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and I think most commentators feel like that these instructions came before this time. This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. This is the month of Nisan or Abib. They're the same month in the Hebrew calendar. The Nisan, Nisan, is the name used in the period after the exile, after the Babylonian exile, and it's still used in the modern Hebrew calendar. Abib, A-B-I-B, is the name that's used in the Torah, the first 5 books in the Bible. And so God makes that the beginning of their year. And he gives the instruction there that each household is to select a lamb on the 10th day of the month. And the lamb must be without blemish, a male of the first year, and it can be taken from sheep or goats. The lamb's to be kept until the 14th day of the month, and then the whole assembly is to kill these lambs at twilight. And some of the blood of the lamb is to be put on the doorpost and the lintel of the houses where the Israelites live. This will be a sign for the Lord to pass over those houses during the plague of the firstborn. The lamb's to be roasted in fire, eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and he's very specific that it's not to be eaten raw or boiled, and leftovers have to be burned before morning. And the Israelites are to eat the food, eat the meal in haste, with a belt on their waist, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to leave there. So we know this event as the Passover, and they receive instructions to celebrate it annually. The Passover figures prominently in the New Testament understanding of the death of Jesus Christ. According to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper, which we commemorate as the Lord's Supper, was a Passover meal. In Luke 22:7, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed, and he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." By highlighting Jesus' unbroken bones, John alludes to the fact that the death of Jesus resembled the Passover sacrifice. In John 19:36, "For these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken." And 1 Corinthians 5:7 makes the connection explicit. "For Christ, our Passover lamb," literally our Passover, "has been sacrificed." 1 Peter 1:18 and 19 also refers to the Passover sacrifice. "Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb, without blemish and without spot. So, that brings us to verse 12, where our literature picks up here. So let's read verses 12 and 13. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am the Lord. I will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt. The blood on the houses where you're staying will be a distinguishing mark for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will be among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So God announces that he will pass through Egypt and strike down all the firstborn, both human and animal, as a judgment against the gods of Egypt. On that same night, this is the 15th of Abib or Nisan, the Lord would pass through Egypt. He would strike down the firstborn of all whose household had not been placed under the blood, where the blood was not sprinkled there and visible. That act demonstrates God's power and authority over the Egyptian gods. Indeed, even all the gods of Egypt would be judged by this final plague. Obviously, those deities whose representatives were linked with beasts like bulls and cows and goats and jackals, etc., were directly impacted. There could be little doubt that this would be interpreted as a direct blow against these gods of Egypt themselves. The blood of the lamb applied to the doorposts and lintel of the houses serves as a sign for God to pass over those houses. This act of faith and obedience by the Israelites ensures their protection from the plague that will strike Egypt. The term Passover comes from this event where God passes over the house marked with blood. In verse 13, he says, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. So those that were marked with that blood on the doorpost and the lintel would be spared from the plague. And that event is celebrated in the Jewish celebration of Passover. It commemorates their deliverance from slavery and God's protection. Now, our lesson text in your literature skips down from there to verse 21, but verses 14 through 20, God gives further instructions there. And he says, this day shall be to you as a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast for an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So the connection between the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread here is close, but they're distinct events. Passover occurs on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, but they eat the unleavened bread for 7 days in order to remember Israel's haste in leaving Egypt, and to underscore again that the leaven, the yeast, is a symbol of impurity and corruption. And so the whole household needed to be pure and clean of heart. And so they took all the yeast out of the houses, removed it there. The first and the seventh day of that week, the Passover day, and then the seventh day of that week of the unleavened bread were to be holy convocations there. You might wonder, why was God so detailed with all this Passover requirements? The Quest Study Bible says the Passover is one of the central events in the history of Israel, and the details for observing it are highly symbolic. God wanted to fix the event in the history, culture, religion, and daily mindset of the Israelites for all generations. Obedience is a key theme in Passover observance. Obeying God's instructions was critical because people's lives depended on it. Israel obeyed God, and he passed over their houses, which spared the lives of their firstborn sons. God then guided them out of slavery, leading them to the promised land. They were led out as people chosen to be different from those around them. The Passover foreshadowed salvation through Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:7. John the Baptist called Jesus the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world in John 1:29. So just as the Israelites were called to trust God for deliverance from their enslavement to the Egyptians, so all people are called to trust Jesus from for their deliverance from the enslavement to sin. So the details of the Passover here provide a picture of God redeeming his people. We pick up with verse 21, and we'll read through verses 20 through verse 28. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go select an animal from the flock according to your families and slaughter the Passover animal. Take a cluster of hyssop, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, and brush the lintel and the two doorposts with some of the blood in the basin. None of you may go out the door of the house until morning. And when the Lord passes through to strike Egypt and sees the blood on the lintel and two doorposts, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your house to strike you. Keep this command permanently as a statute for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, you're to observe this ceremony. When your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' you're to reply, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the house of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and he spared our homes.' So the people knelt low and worshiped. And then the Israelites went and did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron." So, when the instructions for the preparation of the Passover were all completed, Moses called all the elders of Israel together and gave them their instructions, what each Israelite family was to do. They were to select an appropriate animal, and the lamb or goat kid to be slaughtered by each family is called the Passover. Now, some translations say the Passover animal, the Passover lamb, but literally the Passover. And verse 22 adds a couple of new instructions here. The blood was to be applied to each door frame by a cluster or bunch of hyssop dipped into a basin of the blood. And the second thing, no one was to leave the house until morning. So the Israelites are instructed to take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood and apply it to the lintel and two doorposts of the house. Hyssop is a small aromatic plant that had been used. It's been used for centuries for medicinal and ceremonial purposes. In the Bible, it's often associated with purification and cleansing rituals. It's a perennial herb with woody stems, small leaves, clusters of blue, pink, or white flowers, belonging to the mint family. So that's the hyssop there. And they were to stay indoors all night long. And then, as Moses told them, when the Lord passes through, and he's going to strike the firstborns, when he sees the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, he will pass over, and the destroyer will not enter the house to strike you. So the blood on the doorpost serves as a sign for the Lord to pass over the house. This act of faith and obedience by the Israelites here ensures their safety during this plague. The destroyer refers to the agent of God's judgment who would strike down the firstborn in Egypt during the final plague. The figure is often understood to be an angel or a divine messenger carrying out God's command here. That concept of a destroyer is seen as a manifestation of God's power and judgment against the Egyptians. It demonstrates his authority and protection that he provides to his people. In verse 24 and following, we see that not only was the Passover supper an ordinance to be obeyed, but it's also a memorial to be celebrated repeatedly down through the years. And the instructions given that after Israel had entered and conquered the Promised Land, they were to celebrate this Passover each year. It would be easy for them to settle down and forget the acts of God on their behalf, and so the observance of Passover annually would give parents an opportunity to teach their children the meaning of their freedom and what God did for them there. And he suggests that in verse 26, when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? You're to reply, it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, and he spared us. And that led the people to worship. And so, in response to Moses' instructions and Aaron's instructions, Aaron, in verse 29, the Israelites went and did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. Verse 29 and 30 tell us what happened. It came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. So the lesson here is obvious. Unless you're protected by the blood of Christ, when death comes, you'll be completely unprepared, and nobody knows when death's coming there. So this prompted Pharaoh to call for Moses and Aaron, and he said, "Go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone." And once again he says, "And bless me also." And the Egyptian people, they urged the people to go. They wanted them gone because of the devastation that had occurred. And so the people took their dough before it was leavened, and the children of Israel had done what Moses had said, so they were ready to go. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver, gold, clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and so they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Verse 37 tells us that the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. So, I read it's about 8 to 15 miles from Ramses to Succoth, and so they began their journey. They began their exodus here. Approximately 600,000 men on foot. That doesn't include the women and children. Verses 40 here and through 42 tell us that the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all children of Israel throughout their generations. What do we learn from these plagues and then the 10th plague and the Passover that resulted? Our lesson writer makes an important point, I think. He says to be good students of God's Word, we need to be able to take off our own cultural assumptions and view the Bible from an eternal perspective. Much in the Old Testament may offend our modern sensibilities. Many people walk away from Christianity stating they cannot believe in a God who would, and you can insert a number of different things there. Embedded in that statement is a judgment. They're declaring God is wrong to whatever you've inserted there. But the problem with that, we don't get to tell God what's right and wrong. God alone draws that line, and He honors His holiness perfectly. With each of these plagues, God not only gave a glimpse of His wrath and a display of His authority, but He showed compassion for His people. He shielded them from the effects of the plague. But with the last plague, God required a distinguishing mark, and those who obeyed His command, painting the blood of a lamb on their doorposts and lintel, would be passed over by God's grace. The first Passover revealed God's judgment against those who wouldn't obey Him. But He rescued those who obeyed through the blood of the lamb. In God's perfect timing, about 1,500 years later, Jesus was slain during the festival of unleavened bread. Instead of the blood of spotless lambs and goats, Jesus, the perfect Lamb of God, would be the once-for-all sufficient sacrifice for sins. Because of His grace, Jesus Christ provided salvation for those who believed in His name through His blood on the cross, the blood of the Lamb. When I was growing up, we used to sing pretty often an old hymn, When I See the Blood. It was written back about 1892, I think, by John Foote, and it beautifully captures the essence of the Passover story and its fulfillment in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. The lyrics draw a parallel between the blood of the Passover lamb, which protected the Israelites from the plague in Egypt, and the blood of Jesus, which offers redemption and protection to believers. The first verse in that old hymn says, Christ our Redeemer died on the cross, died for the sinner, paid all his due. Sprinkle your soul with the blood of the Lamb, and he will pass over you. And the refrain, when I see the blood, when I see the blood, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Come back next week and we will slow down the pace over the final 3 lessons in this unit of study. We'll look at chapters 15, 16, and 17, I believe. 1 chapter at a time there. So thank you.